Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Joyce Gomez, and I am an associate professor at California State University, Fullerton. Today, I am very happy to chat with you about data-driven instructional support in the high school context. And in particular, today we'll also discuss social justice considerations in relation to this work. We're working toward two specific learning goals. The first is to examine data-driven supports in the high school context, and second, to explore tenets of response to intervention, also known as RTI Fidelity. So let's begin by talking about what content teachers should know about adolescent literacy. So whether you're teaching English language arts or social studies or biology or geography, what are some tenets of literacy that all teachers should be prepared to utilize and address when supporting the broader learning goals of the students in their classrooms? For those of us who are also serving as literacy leaders and specialists, what can we do to also support our colleagues in this ongoing knowledge and development? According to the National Institute of Literacy, we have a lot of students in various communities who have difficulty meeting some of those reading and literacy goals. And this, of course, is for a variety of reasons, including structurally and socially. We'll talk more about that. To address this problem, all educators, including content area teachers, need information on how to incorporate effective literacy learning strategies in the content area curriculum. So there are various components of reading and literacy. So when we think about what areas of strength and what areas of need we're seeing amongst our students, this can include their ability to access or decode a variety of words, including oftentimes multisyllabic words that they might be unfamiliar with in various textbooks, such as a biology textbook or an anatomy textbook. We also want to explore the rate at which they're able to decode those words and the accuracy with which they can decode those words. That's going to impact the fluency with which they read new texts. If fluency is an area of struggle, that might make it challenging for students to focus on the comprehension element of the reading process, where they can really focus on the meaning, the intended meaning, or the information or messages from that text. We also have to consider vocabulary. To what extent are they familiar with some of those tier 2 words, also known as like those academic words that they'll likely see in a variety of contexts, but also what do they do when they encounter words that are unfamiliar to them? Maybe they're content specific, such as like photosynthesis, but they might also not be content specific. It just might be like one of those SAT words. What do they do? What strategies can they utilize to uncover the meaning of that word, whether it's using context clues in the sentence or the surrounding paragraph, or using other elements of the text, which can include pictures to help them obtain that meaning. And then, of course, comprehension, that is an important central element of the reading process. To what extent are students able to fully grasp the author's intended message or information, but also how can they synthesize that information with other sources of info? How do they make inferences when they're reading fictional text? These are all some of the multifaceted elements of reading, and we want to prepare our colleagues. We want to support one another in our ongoing development and learning and effectiveness in utilizing various literacy learning strategies within various content areas to help students successfully engage in the reading processes that go along with each and every one of these specific content areas or fields. When we think about these ideas through a just, equitable, and inclusive lens, it's also a matter of what our students deserve, right? When we think about what they have a right to learn and to achieve, we have an important role in supporting their learning and providing them with the strategies and accommodations that are going to help them thrive. Right. So according to the International Reading Association, students deserve many supports and resources, including content area teachers who are able to provide them with these literacy strategies that they need to successfully meet their learning goals in specific disciplines. They also deserve a school that has a broader culture of literacy and that is collaboratively committed to supporting literacy achievement for all of their students. So, that entails interrogating any assumptions about compartmentalized approaches to instruction where I teach this and you teach that, right? There's certainly a lot of overlap. There's certainly there's a huge demand for interdisciplinary work and knowledge as students prepare for various professions, right? And so we do need to embrace that sense of collaboration as a school community to ensure everyone's working together to make sure our students are meeting various goals. We also need to provide students with multimodal and multiple texts. Especially in this digital world, we need to make sure that students are able to engage with learning through a variety of formats beyond just like kind of printed out passages, black and white text, right? We want to make sure that they're able to access a variety of rich pieces of text and that they're able to engage with that text in a variety of ways and platforms. They also deserve differentiated instruction. There's plenty of research to support the lack of effectiveness with one-size-fits-all approaches, where the assumption is that 5 periods of 35 students are all going to learn the information in the exact same way. So we have to be prepared to utilize those differentiated approaches to support all learners. We also need to provide students with opportunities to participate in oral communication as part of those literacy experiences. This can be in English or a variety of other languages, recognizing that a lot of our students are bringing to the classroom knowledge of various languages. They also deserve opportunities to use literacy in the pursuit of civic engagement. So in this way, it's important for us as teachers to learn more about what's going on in their local or broader communities, what's relevant to their lives, what's important to them, and how can we incorporate that knowledge into our instructional approaches. So for instance, if there are some political events taking place that students are going to be impacted by, is there an opportunity for them to engage in some research, to write letters to political leaders, to develop reports and oral presentations? How could we help them make those connections? Also, students deserve assessments that highlight their strengths as well as their challenges. So pushing back on the idea that assessments are meant to highlight reading deficits. We want to push back on terminology like deficit and really focus on assessments that allow us to illuminate their strengths, but also, of course, areas of need that give us as teachers insight to what scaffolds we need to develop and prepare. And finally, adolescents deserve access to a wide variety of print as well as non-print materials. So we know that there are already a lot of assessment approaches and practices in place across various school districts, but oftentimes these are mandated. Procedures may not have come from or emerged from the teachers themselves, and those assessments can have a place in the data analysis process, but it's also very helpful for teachers to have knowledge of the various assessment tools that they can utilize or develop in their own school sites to help inform their instruction, to help offer insight to the nuances of student learning, which of course is going to offer more specific information about the scaffolds they need to develop for their respective students. And so we want to draw from these different snapshots that various like state level or national level assessments can offer, but it's also helpful to draw from additional assessment measures that can help us develop a full picture of student learning, of course, in these different areas, and to have a sense of where students are in relation to their peers at their school site, or if we're looking at more national norms as well, that can also be helpful. So the data analysis process can also help us identify any discrepancies in trends. It can help us see if maybe we need to reassess, or maybe we need to reteach an entire unit or lesson for our whole class, or if there's different small group opportunities we need to look into or explore. And then this data can also help us, again, decide whether or not we need to differentiate, how we need to differentiate, whether we need to develop small group or intervention sessions with students. There are a variety of assessment tools that we can utilize, and they all hold a unique purpose. Oftentimes at the beginning of the year, we want to implement screeners, and those will help us get a sense of which students might need a bit more support. And in turn, diagnostic assessments allow us to dig a little deeper and see what specific areas of strength and need students might have. Throughout the year, we can also continue to use screeners. Sometimes they're used in the fall or the winter and spring to keep revisiting these. Benchmarks and interim assessments also can help with that, as can classroom-based formative assessments. Those are ongoing. And at the end of the year, as previously mentioned, we might have standard-based accountability measures as well. So there are 6 characteristics of high-quality formative assessments that can guide our instruction as well. They're often following a short cycle. They're frequent, so they help inform our teaching throughout various lessons and units. They might take various forms. Again, it goes back to purpose. You have to have a very well-defined target. So for instance, if you're examining students' comprehension, you want to make sure that your assessment tool is measuring comprehension. If students have some difficulty decoding multisyllabic text, and that's making it challenging for them to access the text, it's difficult to then assess comprehension. So you might want to explore alternative formats that involve like orally sharing those questions with students after they've listened to the text, or exploring other ways that they can showcase their comprehension beyond like an independent read. They also need to offer enough detail to illuminate next steps in your teaching, and they must be paired with appropriate feedback and instructional adjustments. So assessments in and of themselves are not super effective unless they're coupled with intentional data analysis, either by an independent teacher or a team of teachers, and connected to adjustments to your instructional plan. So for instance, if you learn that the student has difficulty accessing text that includes a lot of multisyllabic words, then we're exploring resources that allow us to print alternative passages with diverse lexiles, or we're providing students with audio readings of text. There's a variety of tech resources that allow us to do this. Those are just two examples, but really we want to make sure that those assessment results are driving our instructional approaches. We also need to make sure that high quality assessment involves self-assessment and peer assessment. So we want students to be involved in their learning. They're co-constructing goals with us. This doesn't mean that we're posting student assessment results. This is a very, it could be a very personal journey for students, but we can work together with them to make sure that we're co-constructing their learning targets and their plans, and that they're empowered in developing their own learning as well. So it's also important to note there are a variety of reasons why a high school student might be performing below quote unquote proficiency. As I mentioned earlier, and in a couple examples, the student might have some difficulty reading text accurately and fluently. It might be an issue with vocabulary. They might be unfamiliar with a great deal of the vocabulary, or not have a vast knowledge of different strategies they can use to uncover those meanings. It could be a result of limited knowledge of the content domains in that particular text. They may have limited background knowledge on a particular topic. There can be fundamental language comprehension difficulties, or limited understanding of various comprehension strategies that they can use, as well as some of the questions they should be asking themselves. Sometimes there are poor test-taking strategies that can be involved, or they may not feel super confident in their own views of themselves as readers, which can impact their motivation and engagement. So in all of these scenarios, knowing this information as a teacher means that we can then develop plans to support students. So for instance, if we know that students have low self-efficacy, then what can we do to set students up for success? How do we make sure that they experience success early in the lesson so they can then feel empowered to utilize strategies that we would also couple with our instruction to give them that independence and to empower them to go ahead and, engage in these at first challenging tasks, but that will allow them to refine those strategies so that they can become more and more independent in their own reading abilities. As I mentioned earlier, reading is a very multifaceted process. There's lots of different skills that are working together to help students ultimately access the text and engage with it in a very critical and deep way. So this involves understanding how to decode unfamiliar text, how to make meaning of unfamiliar words, how to make connections between new content and background knowledge, how to store these new concepts in their memory, how to draw from those memories, how to articulate their thoughts and views through oral language and through dialogue with peers or their teachers. So there's lots of different things going on. And so to support students, it's helpful to understand these different components of the reading process so that our interventions or instructional targets can be as precise as possible. When we think about supporting students through data-driven approaches, particularly in a high school context, specific data models such as response to intervention can be very helpful. A case study came out of the work of Fisher and Fry, followed Carver High School for a 2-year period, and what they found was improved achievement, attendance, and GPAs amongst some of the participants. They also found a decrease in special education referrals. And this is an important point because historically we've tended to see disproportionate referrals to special education, particularly among culturally and linguistically diverse learners. And in cases where these are erroneous referrals, and these referrals came mainly out of teachers' struggle in supporting students whose backgrounds might be different from their own, then that means that we need to better support each other as teachers in meeting the academic needs of students in a tier 1 context. In other words, teachers need to be empowered to support a diverse population of learners. Right, so there's some themes that came out of this study. Importantly, a focus on quality core instruction. So how prepared are teachers to differentiate instruction within that tier 1 space so that all of the students are successful? There needs to be a school-wide approach, so everyone needs to be part of the process, and the use of curriculum-based measures to inform intervention. So there has to be a really intentional, clear model in place that everyone can participate in supporting students, particularly as they're going from period to period throughout the school day. So there is a promise that comes with response intervention, or rather the scholarship speaks to some of it, the promise that it holds. It might represent a promising alternative to traditional testing methods for identifying students for like LD or learning disabilities, in that these referrals are founded on long-term data-driven analysis, right? So they're not based on inherent biases, particularly those that might be in relation to cultural and linguistic diversity. They're based on careful, thoughtful data analysis and work toward developing interventions that are appropriate for those individual students. So the potential also stems from identifying students using a risk versus deficit model. So RTI is meant to support students early on, as opposed to identifying students who've been struggling for quite some time and not really doing anything about it. And of course, over time, they struggle more and more as the gap between their learning and their peers' learning and achievement grows. It also involves early identification as well as early support. It reduces cases of identification bias, again, in that it's founded on data-driven measures, and there's a focus on student outcomes. So the focus is on helping students make that growth, as opposed to like proving that they're missing targets. So the onus should be on teachers to develop plans that support the needs of unique students. So here's just like a graphical representation of RTI. It's often reflected through this pyramid. It's a data-driven multi-level intervention system that's used to guide differentiated research-based instruction. So again, RTI emerged from this commitment to pushing back on traditional wait to fail approaches in which students couldn't be identified for or referred for special education evaluation until they reached a certain age or grade level. And usually by that time, like typically fourth grade, students have already fallen so far behind their peers, it makes it very difficult for them to catch up. But that doesn't mean that these supports can't be provided for students at other times in their academic trajectory. So like in high school context. It involves collaborative efforts among multiple stakeholders. So in this case, RTI demands the collaboration of different teachers. So if we're talking about RTI in high school context, this would mean that that biology teacher, that math teacher, that ELA teacher are all at the table having conversations about how to support a particular student. This also involves the collaboration of general education teachers, special education teachers, literacy specialists, parents, the students themselves. It's a very collaborative process. And so when we talk about levels of support that students receive, the standard core curriculum is considered tier 1. But if assessments indicate that students need some more support, that's often taking place at the tier 2 level. So kids are getting a little bit more targeted support, sometimes in small groups. And if students continue to struggle over time, despite teachers' efforts to provide them with these specific interventions, then they would receive even more intensive interventions at the tier 1 level. This is often like instruction that's one-on-one or just a little bit more rigorous. So it begins with examining treatment integrity, also known as RTI Fidelity. And so in other words, this means that there are certain tenets that need to be in place with RTI. Otherwise, we risk limited effectiveness. So importantly, it needs to be research-based, data-driven, and the instructional plans that you have should be effective. And again, going back to research-based, so we want to make sure that we're really intentional on what kinds of strategies we're utilizing to support students. We also want to interrogate high-stakes decisions inextricably tied to RTI implementation. So before we move forward with a referral for special education evaluation, we're really having those thoughtful conversations with our peers about what's going on in the data and to what extent are we really exhausting supports for the student. So like if as a team, we know that we're not really sure how to support students from linguistically diverse backgrounds, then we as a team need to get some support and increase our knowledge and make sure our instructional plans are effective before moving forward with referrals. There are also some ambiguity concerns related to that promise to RTI. So the reauthorization of IDEA 2004 prompted an opportunity for schools to use data-driven models and approaches, but it doesn't specify that RTI has to be used, and it doesn't specify how schools can implement these models too. So there have been different approaches to RTI. The affordance of this is that teachers can really exercise a lot of choice and differentiation in the development of their respective models, which is really important, especially in a high school context that might have a unique calendar with very unique time and resource opportunities. So how can that school create a model that works best for their schedule, their resources, and the needs of their students? But it could also prompt some confusion for those who are still kind of learning about RTI and some of its tenets. There's different approaches that you could take. You could take a problem-based approach, a standards protocol approach. Analysis of data could involve final status or growth model or dual discrepancy. So these are important conversations to have with your school psychologist, with your administrator and other district leaders as you decide what kind of approach you might want to use at your school. And there are some unique elements of RTI that are a bit different from historically traditional approaches. So like, as I mentioned earlier, a one-size-fits-all approach that's often being used in schools is not very helpful in an RTI approach. You want to develop differentiated lessons and strategies to help the unique needs of learners based on what you've learned from the data. And it's also beyond just the responsibility of one teacher. Maybe in high school, this might be the English teacher or the ELA teacher. It needs to be a team approach. So let's talk a bit more about some of these essential components of RTI. What are some of these essential tenets? One, it needs to be research-based instruction. You have to be able to monitor the student's progress over time. This helps us gauge the effectiveness of the plan that we've developed. You have to be able to tweak it accordingly. You also have to offer intervention to students who aren't performing at an academically, quote, proficient level. There has to be an element of data team analysis, and there are multiple tiers of intervention and support. So there is an RTI Fidelity rubric that comes from the Center on Response Intervention that highlights some of these essential components. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these next. The first is assessment. So there's several different assessments that are part of this process, including screening tools, progress monitoring tools, and according to the rubric, there has to be evidence that the screening tools are reliable. There's correlations between the instruments and valued outcomes, and the teachers that are involved in this process are knowledgeable about how to engage in data analysis. So I mentioned universal screening. So universal screening measures are assessments that you administer to all of the students to determine who might need greater support. So they're standardized, they're given to, let's say the entire 9th grade English department decides to administer a particular writing prompt. They've co-constructed a rubric that they've already tested for in-narrator reliability, and you're using that to see which students are on track and which students might need a little bit more support. Some other standard measures have been the use of like fluency measures or vocabulary measures, just to kind of see who needs a little bit more support. When you identify a student who might need greater support, you have to dig a little deeper and see where are the precise areas of struggle as well as strength. So these assessments can help us unpack this a bit more. So like reading inventories or other measures that help us unpack comprehension can be very helpful depending again on the area that we're targeting. And then once we've developed a plan for a student based on their unique needs, we've developed a learning goal, we have to monitor their progress over time. So like if our goal is to help a student retell more key details from a text that they've read, then every week or every 2 weeks, we would invite the student to participate in a short assessment that allows us to gauge that. So like, let's say they read a passage and you know that they've recalled 5 details, and the following week they retell 7 details. And so we would want to use that type of progress monitoring method to see whether or not students are making growth. Because if they're not, if they're performing below our goal, then we have to revisit that. We also, of course, are using various forms of assessment in our standard Tier 1 core instruction too. These are tied to the curricular content. They offer teachers immediate feedback, and they enable teachers to interact with students immediately to give them immediate support. So this can include observations, discussion, anecdotal records, a variety of things can be going on in that classroom, and that's coupled with our RTI data. So here I have just a couple different examples of classroom-based assessments like retellings, questionings, evaluating different reading products. I also have here 1-minute fluency assessments. This is how many words how many words the student can read correctly in 1 minute from a passage, but with the caveat that this is often a goal for students before they reach the high school level. So if you use a measure like the core NASER reading assessment, which measures students' reading rates, you'll see that it goes up to 8th grade. So here you can see, using the chart, a student performing in the 90th percentile in the spring would be reading about 199 words per minute. Beyond that, students who can read fluently don't need to necessarily make any more growth in the number of words they can read in a minute. If students can read with enough fluidity to really focus on comprehending the text, then fluency might not necessarily be something we want to look at. But if you already note some concerns about that, like you notice that the student's reading very slowly, they struggle with reading multiple words on a page, then fluency could be something you look into a little bit more closely. You also need to critically evaluate each of the assessments you're using. This is why the use of multiple measures is really important, because each tool is going to have its affordances as well as its limitations. There are some tools that don't account for cultural and linguistic bias, and makes it really difficult for us to rely on that information and those results to make informed decisions. So you have to make sure that the tools that you're using are research-based. You have to draw from the research to kind of learn a little bit more about individual tools before you use them as a broader community. If you find things online, you want to look into those a bit more before you make them a part of your core instruction. And with that, you also want to consider all of the systems of support students might need. RTI is often part of a broader multi-tiered system of support, also known as MTSS, where students are receiving academic support, but also we're looking at behavior, we're looking at socio-emotional learning. What else might students need in order to make that growth in reading or literacy? So we also have to think about sound practices throughout the school, which include universal designs for learning, making sure that our core instruction includes these considerations of how to support students with diverse academic needs, language supports, to what extent are we utilizing culturally responsive and sustaining approaches, to what extent do teachers have access to ongoing professional development and learning. We have to look at attendance and basic needs. If students are facing some challenges in getting to school, or if they're at school and they're hungry and they have other important needs, we have to address those as well, because of course that's going to impact their ability to make growth and fluency and comprehension. So again, to kind of summarize, an RTI model involves multiple forms of assessment, including universal screening, diagnostic, progress monitoring, as well as some of the standard assessment practices that we would see in the core Tier 1 curriculum. And so all of this information helps us engage in data-based decision-making. And so our rubric shows that making decisions involves engaging in data-driven, validated methods. So we're using sound measures. It involves a broad base of stakeholders. So that means there are lots of people at the table, and we're very intentional about who's at that table, including families and maybe the student themselves. It's also operationalized with clear established decision rules. So we're not going off of hunches. We're checking those biases and assumptions. We're making sure that our assertions about student learning are supported with the data. So we can say, for instance, we feel that there should be a fluency goal as evidenced by these scores that show the student is not reaching quote unquote benchmark for their respective grade level. So here are some strategies we feel that would support these goals in fluency. So we want to make sure our language is very precise, very clear, very professional and humanistic, right? So if we're including families and students at this data table, we want to make sure we're honoring their strengths, we're honoring their knowledge, and being very, very, very mindful of how our language is supportive and empowering in helping students make growth. Another important component is infrastructure and support mechanisms. This means that the RTI team, again, reflects diverse stakeholders. There's clear structures and processes, and the time is set aside to meet regularly. So this goes back also to leadership. Strong leadership is really important to develop that collaborative space. There has to be time, there has to be space. So this can include the use of technology to help us, like Google Docs and other shared drives allow us to input data, to access and view and analyze data. The affordances of Zoom mean that maybe parents can join from different spaces. They don't necessarily have to be there face-to-face if that's a challenge, but we have to create spaces for folks to come together at certain points to have these discussions. So that does go back to leadership and broader school community dialogue, where we can co-construct spaces for this to take place. This also involves fidelity and evaluation. So we have to make sure that the RTI processes that we have in place are refined and revisited and refashioned based on the needs of our students and the needs of our teachers. There have to be clear procedures in place to progress monitor, to administer and analyze assessment. So teachers will need support in knowing what exactly the process is. What shared assessments will we be utilizing? What are the processes for evaluating them? What are the spaces for us to have dialogue about them? So I know teachers, we already do this, right? We have these conversations in the hallway. We know that teaching is a collaborative endeavor, but it's also important to have these intentional spaces for that work to happen. And we want to make sure teachers are supported in knowing what the procedures are and knowing how to engage in careful data analysis. And again, it is a multi-level instructional process. So we have to have really key, strong core tier 1 instruction. So if the data is showing that a lot of our students are not meeting these quote benchmarks, that means that as a team, as a school community, we have to think about how we could refine those core practices at the tier 1 level. We also need to look at our tier 2 practices. How are those intentional and strategic? Sometimes tier 1 intervention can be as short as like 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. So it has to be really tight. It has to be really clear, really focused to make sure we're utilizing that time as efficiently as possible. Similarly with tier 3, we have to also think outside the box. If we know that inviting students to read these printed out passages isn't working, that we're not seeing engagement, that we have to, think outside the box. What are some authentic reading materials that we can use? What's something that's going to grab the students' interest, that's going to be relevant to them? To what extent are they seeing themselves in these texts? We can also draw from diverse forms of text like poetry or song lyrics or magazine articles. We really have to be mindful of what we can do to meet the unique needs of this individual learner. Also, when we're thinking about tier 3, we're thinking about identifying very clearly the area that we need to target. We have to review the data from tier 1 and tier 2 to make informed decisions. We have to draw from multiple forms of data. So again, this is why it's so important to have all of these stakeholders at the table. what are our observations in that biology class and in that math class? What are trends that we're seeing, and what are shared practices that we can use? So for instance, if we've learned that we need to provide students with support in determining the meaning of new vocabulary words, how can all of these teachers reinforce those strategies in their respective classrooms? When a student is reading a word problem, when a student is reading a biology text, what are common strategies that we're teaching them to use and to draw from, so that they start to really own those strategies themselves? We want to make sure that we're developing appropriate intensive interventions. And by intensive, we mean just like really, really focused and aligned with what that student needs. So here are just a couple of questions and prompts that data team members can draw from in facilitating some of these conversations and working toward developing solutions. You, of course, can create something that works for you, but notice that it's very intentional and very organized. So we want to make sure that we're setting that standard for those meetings, and we're prepared, right? We have access to the data, the progress monitoring data. The charts can be really helpful. They give us a nice visual of what we've been seeing across several weeks, and they allow us to make informed decisions. So if we have a goal line that's based on the amount of growth we would like to see, or would be fair to see across time, again, if going back to that retail goal, if our goal is across 12 weeks to see a student increase the number of retold details by like one event per week, then we have to compare that to the data we're actually seeing on a week-to-week basis. Is the student surpassing the goal, meeting the goal, or having difficulty obtaining that goal? Each of those is going to have some implications for our instruction. We either maintain the plan because it's working, or we make some changes to help us support that student. And those changes have to be very intentional as well. We can't use a completely new strategy, completely new plan on a week-to-week basis, because that makes it really difficult for us to see what's working and what's not without that consistency. So we really have to be mindful about that. So like, for instance, if the first few weeks we're using printed out passages and we're not seeing any growth, someone can say like, hey, we should try using more authentic materials. What does the student like to read? And try pulling from those materials. If after that we see more growth, that gives us some insight to what's effective for that student. Oh, they need to be able to have practice with this skill with text that's relevant to their lives. What text is relevant to them? How can they access those books on their own? Oh, here's some book recommendations. Here's the library the student could go to on the weekend so they continue to read at home. So when engaging in those tier 3 practices, there has to be some commonalities, shared missions and values, essential standards, and essential practices and tools that the students are all, the instructors are all drawing from. And these resources will allow us to develop tier 3 supports that are effectively intense and explicit. So again, we want these to be very clear and organized. So in conclusion, we want to develop data-driven processes that allow for collaborative data discussions amongst all of the stakeholders who are supporting the needs of students. So there are a variety of ways that this can happen. So it's important for us to have those conversations with our team at our respective high school sites. So here are a couple questions we might want to consider moving forward. What systems are in place in my classroom or in my school to implement data-driven instruction? What progress have I seen or not seen among my students? How am I gauging that learning? What assessments am I utilizing To what extent have I examined the reliability and validity of those respective instruments? What's worked? What would I do differently? And what recommendations would I share with colleagues moving forward? Thank you so much for participating in this session. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Bye-bye.